I'm sorry, could you put that back up there? This is our year, said every year by Cowboys fans, wishing this was still the 90s. The one thing the Cowboys have going for them is their fans. And there are some weird fans out there. Like, as you look at different NFL fans, and you're like, okay, if you just Google, don't do it, because you're going to end up in some really ugly places on the internet. And I don't know if you know this, but not all of the internet is pure and holy and righteous. But the poor Cowboys, man, they just don't have much going for them. But every year at this time, that's the statement. This is our year, says the Cowboys fan. And yet, it's been 2 weeks into the preseason. And somehow, 2 weeks into the preseason, the Cowboys are 0-3. Like, how is that even? It's not possible. No other team has been able to accomplish that. So they've got that going for them, I guess, as well. But for me, and this is important for you to know, because as you're wondering, oh man, he's just hitting them hard, all these lovely people that talked to him last week who know who they are. You have to understand that I grew up as a Green Bay Packers fan in the 90s, okay? That was my coming of age as a Green Bay Packers fan. And in 1994, and in 1995, and in 1996, 3 years in a row, the Green Bay Packers were eliminated from the playoffs by the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah, Brett Favre and Edgar Bennett and Robert Brooks and the Minister of Defense, Reggie White, were eliminated 3 years in a row by Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin and Deion Stinkin' Sanders. And every year, like, the Packers were like, oh, this is our year, because there was this guy named Brett Favre who just didn't know how to throw it to the right people, but he at least knew how to throw it. And so every year we thought, this is our year, and it never happened. And so being 17 years ago, this is a little fresh for me, right? Like, so still to this day, when Troy Aikman's on there, like, I just want to mute it. Can I get an amen? Like, when he's the one who's the announcer, I'm just like, I can't handle that. That's Troy Aikman. Blech. But I've never actually been to an NFL game. Really interesting, in spite of the fact that I'm a huge Packers fan. I've never been to a preseason game, regular season, a playoff game, never been to Lambeau Field even to check it out. I had some friends who headed up there from Springfield to just check it out. I've never done that. I've never been to an NFL field. In spite of that, I am on the waiting list for Green Bay Packers season tickets. And I want you to know that at this point, I officially have a priority number. I've been on this waiting list for 6 years, which means that my number is now 122,462. Which means that I'm in front of 25,000 other people. Because the waiting list for Green Bay Packers season tickets is 150,000 people long. It's 45 years. There was a guy this week, it was just a news story. There was a guy who got his tickets. He's 45 years old because his dad, when he was 1 day old, put him on the waiting list for Green Bay Packers season tickets. And so he just got them this week. And that was in the 80s before the Packers were good again. And this is like the fan dynamic for the Green Bay Packers. And when I was growing up, there was a kid in my school whose dad, and I would say he was my friend, but I never talked to him. But I still say he's my friend because that's what I do. And his dad was the one who invented the cheese head. Yeah. And so every day this kid would get dropped off for school in a Humvee. This was before Humvees were like something people could buy. And so it was like still a military vehicle in like the early 90s that he had painted the same color as the cheese heads. And they had put indentations all the way around the car. And I mean, around the Humvee. And I was like, I wasn't sure if it was cool or weird at the time. Looking back on it, that was dumb. But like, at the time, we were like, man, look at that Humvee. It looks like cheese. And I actually do have a couple of cheeseheads. Okay, so I am a Packers fan. Now, I have yet to stop and think about how weird it is that you got a bunch of people with cheese on their head. Like, that's just a weird thing to do, but that's how you know you're a Green Bay Packers fans. But Packers and fans in general just do weird things. And every time I think the Packers fans are bad, all I have to do is look at Raiders fans. Like, that's a deep, dark hole you do not want to go into. Like, you don't want to see Raiders fans in public, right? They're the type of people you go over to the other side of the street when you see them walking down the street. But fans are passionate. A few months ago, Forbes did a study to find out who was the number one most passionate fan base in the United States. And so, like, there's a lot of different ways you could do that. You could do that by how much body paint do they buy. And you could do that based on what they put on their head. Like the Saints all wear Pope hats, and the Packers wear cheese heads, and the Raiders do the whole, like, Viking/gladiator look, which I'm not entirely, like, you could do passion based on those sorts of things, but they wanted to do something that was a little less subjective, a little more objective. So what they did was they looked at television ratings, game attendance, merchandise sales, social media reach, and they examined all 123 professional teams in all of the different professional sports, so NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, and they examined all 123 teams to see who had the most passionate fan base. Do you know who's number one? Green Bay Packers. Chiefs were not even in the top 10. But the Green Bay Packers were number one. You know who else wasn't in the top 10? Dallas Cowboys. And they're supposed to be America's team. They did get number one in something else, though. Was that a male voice or a female voice? I just heard say cheerleaders. Okay, good. A little more appropriate then. Cowboys did show up number one in a different study. This happened in October to like November of last year. 5,000 NFL fans, it was like 5,207 or something like that. NFL fans were surveyed, and they named Cowboys fans as the number one for having fans that complain the most. They had the number one victim mentality. So in a way, America's team. I'm sorry. Sorry. Beautiful people. You know, there have been some other interesting studies that have been done over the last several decades about fandom as a form of religious worship. It's really interesting because not coming from like Christian circles, I'm talking about sociologists in general, looking at some of the interesting parallels, and there's a ton of academic articles and studies on this idea of how professional sports is the last, we'll call, civic religion. The last type of thing where you would have an entire society that gather around one purpose together and all want the same thing together as like a form of religious worship. And so there's a ton of studies and academic papers you can find just on this idea. There was a sociologist about 100 years ago whose name was Emil Durkheim. And Emil Durkheim decided he wanted to see in ancient Australia the things that held societies together. And so he did this massive kind of archaeological dig, and then also looking deeply into all of these old ancient cultures and tribes to discover what ties kind of bound them together and held them together as a culture. And he wrote this book called The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life in 1915. And for years, this book has been referred back to as like from sociologists for literally a century now, talking about religious life. In the last few decades in particular, Durkheim has been really kind of quoted a lot in relation to understanding professional sports with this undercurrent of what we'll just call religious worship. And he said, essentially in this book, whenever a society worshipped a totem, so like a thing that is in the center, right? Like a deity or a divine form. Whenever a society worshipped a totem or a divine form, it was also simultaneously worshiping itself. That the group would gather around that totem, that divine form, and it would unify them and give them a common goal. You know what's interesting to me? And I'm not slamming professional sports. Obviously, I'm a Green Bay Packers fan, but there are some really interesting parallels. And this is at least part of the reason why some believers struggle with like professional sports, because you can feel it a little bit, right? Like there's something off about how enthusiastic we get about sports. Even there was a guy named Bob Wilkinson, who, anybody know who that is? Yeah, that's because I'm really smart. He was a coach for OU, for the Sooners in like the 40s and 60s, 40s to the 60s. For like 20 years, he was any Sooners fans in here? Those people have not been listening to the sermon up until now. No, I'm just kidding. But he was the coach for the Sooners, and he was asked to describe football in 1965. Here's how he described it. He said, "Football is 22 men on the field in desperate need of rest, surrounded by 80,000 fans desperately in need of exercise." Oh, it's like, oh. But you can feel there's something just a little weird about it, right? And even this last year in particular, when the fans were all removed from the stadiums, it just felt totally different. Like it was a weird experience to like see football without fans there. Like the fans and the fan experience and the whole surrounding it, like you miss a whole chunk of it. You don't realize what part of it is the participation of the fans until they're gone. And it, to me, only got weirder when the professional sports, like the different leagues, decided we're going to try to overcome this. And so the way that they did it was some of them put like cardboard cutouts in the stands. And that just got weirder to me. And they would try to like make it really sweet. Like, and they put out all these stories like, this guy's never missed a game in 50 years. And now there's a cardboard cutout sitting in his seat. That's just weird. And then I thought the weirdest was the NBA, where they put TVs on the sideline, and then they had famous people on screen kind of like watching the game. And it was just this kind of like, it just felt so inward. It felt so, something was off, I'll say that. It just, like you gotta at least get a little bit of a sense of uneasiness with how all these things kind of work together. Is it interesting to you, I've never been to Lambeau, that Lambeau is referred to as, well, frozen tundra too, hallowed grounds? You ever hear that? These are hallowed grounds. No, they aren't. It's a football field, but that's the way we talk about it. You find at least some of this kind of worshiping of a totem or a worshiping of a form, of a worshiping of ourselves, really. Like, as if I am a Packers fan and the Packers are doing great and I'm on cloud nine, that has nothing to do with me. And yet somehow I identify with this team and it brings me some sort of joy or just devastation depending on how this team does. Does that just feel a little bit off for you? Like it should. It should be something that there's at least, and I think the reason for it is that there is at least a little bit of a flavor of worship with fandom and professional sports. There's at least a little bit of a flavor of a corporate group. I mean, because if you can talk to your grandpa about sports, but you can't talk to him about Jesus Christ, there's a problem. But that's kind of like this unifying factor that we can get around. And I wonder if there isn't some truth at least to it. The thing about worship is that we're all doing it. Some people in our modern world would say, I don't worship anything. I gave up my faith long ago. And that may be true. Faith is declining. Faith in institutions, faith in your job, faith in family, faith in government, faith in the church, faith in God may be declining. Worship is not. We all worship something. We can pretend we don't, but worship is not dwindling. It is impossible not to worship because it is central to who God made us to be. So we will always worship something. Whatever we want most or crave or desire, those things we hold most dearly, we will inevitably worship. We will adore whatever we value highest. See, we think of worship as like singing a few songs. Worship is so much larger than that. It is any time that anything holds a place of contemplation or regular consideration, or I want or desire something, when I have it in that highest place, that's the thing that I'm going to adore. And the scripture calls anything but God in that place idolatry. So, worship as a form like that is happening all over the world. Now, I want to get into a verse, 1 Peter, chapter 2, verse 11. And this is a verse that's been on my heart a lot for the last week in particular, maybe because of this idea, at least to start with. But it kept reminding me of a lot of things this week in particular. But that Durkheim quote, that idea that as we worship something, it provides our identity. That's exactly what Peter is talking about all through 1 Peter. He starts off and he shares and he says in that passage, or right before this, he says, listen, you used to be a people with no identity. He said, but now you have an identity. See, God has made you his own. Now you are God's people. He says you're a chosen people. You are royal priests. You are a holy nation. You are God's own possession. He says that's your identity. He says that's who you are. Know that. And then he says in verse 11 of chapter 2, 1 Peter, he says, dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. There is a war going on. And I guess I've been thinking about this a lot this last week because of what has been happening in Afghanistan. And you think, what in the world? Did we not know this was coming? I was mad. I was mad. And then I prayed, and I was still mad. And I prayed some more, and I was still mad. I was angry all week long. As you kind of see and recognize, and it comes to light, that in reality, at the highest levels, we did know this was going to happen. And we just didn't tell any of the people who were in the line of fire. And so all these people in Afghanistan, what if they would have known 6 months ago? What if they would have been warned? How would things be? I mean, and I know I was just devastated by some of the images coming out of Afghanistan and some of the things that were happening. And I'm thinking, why didn't we give them a warning that come August, and even if we didn't think it was going to happen in August, we thought it would happen by the end of the year. Why didn't we tell them 6 months ago? And I'm sitting here asking all of these questions, and that's exactly what Peter is doing in this passage. He is saying, you know your identity. You are a temporary resident and foreigner. Do not lose sight of that. It's easy as things are going along in your daily life to lose sight of the fact that you are not of this world. And so he says, let me warn you again, remind you again, this is not your home. he says, because of that, be aware that there are to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. He says there is something that is waging war against your souls, and he's warning them. He doesn't want them to be surprised. He doesn't want them to be taken off guard. And let me say, I don't think I'm overselling it to say this is the most important battle. Because what does it say the battle is for? Your souls. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 46, he says, what do you profit if you get the whole world, but you lose your soul? Is there anything more valuable than your soul? Of course there's nothing more valuable than our souls. This is the greatest and most important battle. And what he says is waging it. He doesn't say it's Satan, although I can guarantee you Satan's right in the mix. What is it? Worldly desires. And we can read that word and that phrase and we can think, okay, this is talking about those most sinful desires. But that's not the word that's used here. The word that's used here is the same word that Paul uses when he says, I long, I desire, I crave, I want to go and be with Jesus. It's the same word. It's the same word that Jesus uses in Mark when he's talking about the word of God and how it can be stolen away. And he says when the word goes out, what is it that can take away from it? He says the worries of this life, the lure of wealth, and the desire just for other things. And so when it says desire, what it's talking about, and specifically worldly desire, this isn't just talking about the most sinniest of sin desires that you can think of. This is everyday, normal desires, deep desires that we hold that get turned by the world. These are the basic wants and desires of humanity. So what this is saying is, the desire to be liked is waging war against your very soul. The desire to be important can cause you to lose your soul. The desire to be safe, the desire to be loved, the desire for wealth, the desire to be respected, the desire to be right can cause us to lose our very souls. Let me talk you through what that could look like. I believe, am convinced deeply, that the desire to be right. Have you ever known somebody who always has to be right? And for them to be right, you need to be wrong. Right? Right? I know I'm right. You're wrong. Whatever. But that desire to be right, that desire to be good, really comes from a deep, innate desire to be in right standing with God. I believe that. And I believe that the reason why I have that inside of me is because God is the one who created me to be in fellowship and right standing with him. So I have this driving passion inside of me to be in right standing with God. What happens is the world comes along and says, that desire really is for something else. You need to be true to yourself. Or you need to always be right. And so if you find somebody who has to push other people down in order to get themselves up, what it is that they are trying to do at a deep level, I am convinced of, is to be in right standing with God. And they don't even know it. And here's the thing. These worldly kind of corruptions of the way we were, the desire to be safe, that is not unhealthy. It's a desire ultimately to be hidden under God's wing, I'm convinced of. And what happens is we corrupt that, and then we find our way to be safe, and maybe that includes a little bit more wealth. And study again after study will tell you a little bit more is never the answer. That there is something that is known as the hedonic treadmill, that you just keep on running. And the more pleasure you get a little bump of satisfaction for a moment, but then it always goes right back down. You think you need a little bit more money, it will not get you there. You think you need a little bit nicer house, it will not get you there. You think you need a little bit nicer car. It will not get you the satisfaction and happiness that you are looking for, because those things cannot do it. And all the advertisers in the world will tell you, you just need this one more thing, and it will answer that deep desire. And they all connect to different desires all the time with all of the advertisements. And all this messaging is coming at you constantly. It is warring against your soul and trying to turn you away from your relationship with Jesus Christ. But the reason those desires are there is because we were made to be in relationship with God. And until we realize that desire to be liked, that desire to be important, that desire to be safe, that desire to be loved, that all of that was made to be met in Jesus Christ, we will always be unhappy. We were made to crave. We were made to want. We were created with that as our center, and it drives us. And the world corrupts it and turns it and says it can only be satisfied with this or with that. And a little bit more of a good thing will never get you there unless it's Jesus Christ. So we battle for our desires. Read the next verse. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. Did you catch the order of that? It starts with desire. He says, fight on the level of desires, not actions first. Actions pour out of desire. So you focus and you fight and you battle on the level of your wants and your desires, your cravings, in order that it might change the way you act. And if you're fighting on the level of your actions only, that's like if you're fighting a battle for the air and the battle's on the ground, right? Like the Taliban. They were in Toyota Hiluxes with machine guns on the back. And if we're looking for air supremacy and not affecting the ground battle, we're going to completely miss it. Okay? That's what he says happens here. If you are fighting just to act better, but not getting to the root of the desire and wants that drive those actions, it is not enough. We need to understand that these things are being corrupted, and it is a battle for my soul at the level of my desire, not actions. Our actions will, by and large, spring from our desires. That's the pattern we see here. Okay, so what does all that have to do with worship? It has to do with this whole series. Because this whole series has been about these basic things that we do, these basic plays, these basic strategies, these basic disciplines that affect us deeply. Why is prayer important? Why is generosity important? Why is the word important? Because there is a battle for our souls happening on the ground of our hearts, our wants, our desires, and our values. And reading the word changes those desires. The way the Bible talks about it is it impacts the inclinations or the leanings of our heart. Prayer impacts our heart when we close our door and pray, so that no other benefit but my relationship with God, and no one else knows, that it changes even the things that I value and desire and want. And my desire for him is strengthened. Generosity impacts our hearts. That's why Jesus said, where your treasure is, your heart will follow. Generosity impacts what our heart wants, and worship impacts our hearts as well. See, why do we worship? We worship because he deserves it. We worship because he is worthy. Because he has said, I dwell in unapproachable light. Yet, I have given Jesus Christ that you can approach the throne of grace with confidence in time of need. So I'm unapproachable, but I'm going to let you approach through Jesus Christ. We worship because he's worthy. But we also worship because he is perfect. Every other person will let us down but him. And in that, we see that his ways are higher than our ways, more perfect. And we get jaded and we get cynical, but our cynicism does not lessen his perfection. And he is beautiful. Psalm 16 says that all pleasure is at his right hand, pleasure more than this world could ever offer. And if we believe that by faith, then we come running to him time and time and time again. We don't need any other reason but that to worship him. That is why we worship. But worship also changes us. It changes our hearts. Every Sunday when we gather together and raise our hands and surrender to him and lift our voices in song as we contemplate his perfection and his worthiness and his beauty, it changes the things that our hearts want. It reminds us that we are temporary residents and foreigners on this earth, and that we might not be lulled and seduced and ultimately destroyed by the desires that are warring against our souls. So, if that's the case, do you think that worship might be a battle? If you think the enemy knows that first God receives and deserves all glory and honor and praise, do you think the one who tried to usurp that throne might battle against you when you come to worship him? Oh, and more than that, he knows that there is a worldly desire battling against your soul. And the moment that you come in to worship God, it is starting to redefine and redirect your heart more and more towards God. Do you think that Satan's just going to let you come in and worship without trying to get in the way? No, he is going to come at you constantly and distract you repeatedly. Every single time you worship, he is going to throw things at you. If you think you're going to walk in, sing a couple songs, and listen to a message, you are missing the point that worship will always be war. It will be war because there is a war going on for your very soul. And it is happening constantly. And you'll start to sing the first song, and there'll be a distraction, and you might fight that off. But then there'll be a slightly less obvious and more subtle distraction. And if you fight off that one too, you'll be fine for the verse, and then you hit the chorus, and your phone will buzz. It's just the way it is. And every single time you seek to worship, it will be war. It is war against the desires which war against your soul. And worship is putting those desires back in their proper place. And so it will always be a fight. You see, here's my experience. My experience is that every single day I find that I am both Moses and Aaron. That every single day I am both crafting and destroying golden calves. That every single day I am meeting with God and also returning angry at myself for my foolishness while I was gone. Every single day it is a battle to destroy the same idols that I have built on that day. Every single day it is a war for my soul, and worship is a weapon. That's not even what it might have been intended to be. It is just because he is worthy of all glory and honor and praise. And yet, it is also a powerful weapon. It is a weapon against the enemy, which would seek to distract us or point us in different directions. So anytime you seek to focus in worship, the enemy will seek to pull you away. And those desires and those distractions will war against your soul. And what you do in that moment will determine what happens next. When I was younger as a dad, early on, Asher was in a wagon. We were taking him over to the zoo. We were pulling him through this rocky part. And he fell out of the wagon. It was Liz's fault. And I'm just kidding. Clara, I'm sorry. He fell out of the wagon, clocked his head. To this day, he still has a scar there. right there on his forehead. And I know exactly what it's from. It was actually my fault. And I cut his hair, and so I see it regularly anytime I cut his hair, and I remember exactly that moment every single time. Because I remember he was losing it, and we're surrounded by people, and he's bleeding. And I was just holding him close and locking in on him and telling him to lock in on me. And I remember people around us, and I could barely even hear their voices. They were all giving their input or trying to offer help, and I can't even, it was like all that stuff just kind of blurred away, and it was him and it was me together. And in a way, that's what worship ought to be. Lock in on Jesus Christ, and all those other desires, all those other wants, all those other distractions just begin to fade away. And that's why I would say, never judge someone else's worship. Ever. Because you don't know. You might know all the reasons why they are not worthy to worship that way. But if you know all the reasons why they aren't worthy, most likely you're not paying attention to the reasons why you're not worthy. Worship isn't about us being worthy. It's about him being worthy. And you and I don't know the battle that that person is going through in order to worship in that moment. And most likely, if you're judging them, you don't recognize you're losing your battle. Because it's that same desire. You're looking for, I'm right and they're wrong. They're down and I'm up. And really, you need to recognize that that desire is totally unhealthy, unchristlike, and could cost you your soul eventually. So never judge somebody else's worship, because you don't know the battle that that person is going through. So what you do in that moment is you battle back. You lock back in on Jesus Christ and you worship him again. You focus back in on him and say you are worthy and you are perfect and you above any other deserve it. You are beautiful. And you lock back in. And don't let anybody else judge you for your worship. Because you battle for you. And what I have seen time and time again is that more often than not, when one person presses in, others come along with them. And sometimes our battle encourages other people in their battle to worship as well. This whole series has really been about how we impact our own heart by these basic disciplines of the faith. It doesn't mean we worship for this reason. What I am saying is it is a powerful weapon in a war against your soul. And your desires can come back into alignment with what they should be as you worship. So here I have one favor to ask of you today. One favor. That favor is this. And some of you probably already do this. Many of us probably do this. But my favor is this. This week in particular, would you start every single morning with worship? Would you start every single morning with at least one song to God? And see what happens in your heart. See what happens to your focus. See what happens to your wants. See which way your heart turns. You can pick the song. But every morning, sing at least one song to God. Lock in on him, want him, worship him. And that's what we're going to do right now. And as we do, I think it's really interesting that we can worship without words. Even earlier when I was worshiping, for a big chunk of it, I wasn't singing. It's possible to worship without words. You can worship without your hands. You can worship without your eyes. You can worship without your ears. But it is impossible to worship without your heart. Not just because you'd be dead, But Jesus said it. Jesus, when he was quoting Isaiah, he said, these people, they worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. He says, as a result, their worship is a farce. It is impossible to worship without your heart. True worship will always involve our wants and our desires being turned towards him. It is impossible to worship without your heart. This morning as we sing, I just want to speak to you if you're in here. And maybe normally during worship, you just kind of go with the flow. Just kind of sing, just kind of do what everybody else is doing. But you don't stop and think about the words. Today, maybe as others are singing, maybe you need to sing nothing and just contemplate the words that are on the screen and ask yourself, do you really mean them? And maybe you're in here and, man, this whole thing that we've been talking about and faith in Jesus Christ is something that you have never come to a conclusion on. Man, I am so glad you are at Praise, and I want you to keep coming, okay? Keep coming. But understand that what we are doing is more than just singing a few words. This is something that comes from the heart of someone who desires God above all. And it might look weird to you. You might wonder, why do they do that way? I'm telling you that it's about a process. This has been going on for literally thousands of years. That God created humanity, and humanity in right relationship with him returns worship back to him. And so today, even in a moment when we stand and we worship, if you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ, it doesn't need to look a very specific way. What I'm saying is, it is possible as the song is being sung for you to put your faith in him as you begin to sing those same words, to say, oh God, I believe that you are who you said you are. And as you believe and confess that he is Lord, that it is possible to receive salvation in the middle of a song, because it's about the heart and what is happening there. So today as we sing, I'm going to invite you to stand with me. And I encourage you to ask yourself, do I mean this? Do I want this? Do I long for this? Do I desire this? And if the answer is no, then maybe in that moment, by faith, you would step out, press in, and see what God does in your heart today.